There is a quiet belief that rarely gets questioned, that intelligence improves life, that the more you understand, the more control you gain, the more clearly you see, the easier everything becomes. It sounds reasonable, almost self-evident, but reality tells a different story, because there is a point, subtle, almost invisible, where understanding stops feeling like an advantage and starts becoming something else entirely. A weight. At first, it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like clarity. You begin to notice patterns others miss. You hear what isn't said. You see through explanations that once felt convincing. The world becomes sharper, more detailed, more exposed. But with that clarity comes something unexpected. You can no longer simplify things the way others do. Where someone sees a simple decision, you see layers of consequence. Where someone feels certainty, you feel hesitation. Where someone moves forward without thinking, you remain aware. And awareness does something strange. It removes the comfort of ignorance, but replaces it with nothing equally stable. The mind begins to hold multiple possibilities at once. Contradictions, uncertainties, outcomes that have not yet happened, but already feel real. You don't just experience reality. You experience everything that could go wrong within it. And slowly, almost without noticing, thinking stops being a tool. It becomes an environment. You don't step into it. It surrounds you. Even in silence, it continues. Analyzing, replaying, expanding. There is no clear off switch. And this is where the tension begins to take shape. Because what once felt like intelligence now starts to feel like exposure. You begin to realize that seeing more does not necessarily mean living better. That clarity does not guarantee peace. In fact, it may quietly take it away. And the unsettling question that follows is difficult to ignore. What if the very thing you trust to guide you is the same thing making it harder to exist comfortably within your own mind? There is a comforting idea people rarely question, that intelligence protects. It suggests that if you understand enough, if you analyze deeply enough, you can avoid unnecessary pain. That awareness acts as a kind of shield, filtering out confusion, reducing mistakes, keeping you one step ahead of reality. And on the surface, it appears to work. You make fewer impulsive decisions. You recognize patterns early. You anticipate consequences before they unfold. From the outside, it looks like control. But control in thought does not translate to control in feeling, because the same mind that predicts outcomes also lives inside them before they happen. This is where the illusion begins to fracture. An analytical mind does not simply observe reality, it expands it. Every possibility becomes visible. Every risk becomes defined. And once something is clearly seen, it cannot be unseen. You don't just know what could go wrong, you experience it internally in advance. And this creates a quiet contradiction. The very ability that should protect you from suffering begins to generate it, not through events but through anticipation, not through reality, but through awareness of it. A person with less analytical depth may encounter uncertainty and move forward anyway. Their lack of over-analysis allows them to act, to feel, to recover. But the intelligent mind hesitates. It weighs, it reconsiders, it simulates outcomes repeatedly, searching for certainty that never fully arrives. And in that process, something subtle happens. You are no longer reacting to life as it is. You are reacting to life as it could be. The mind begins to treat imagined scenarios with the same seriousness as real ones. Emotional responses are triggered not by events, but by the understanding of those events. This is not protection. It is exposure. Because now, nothing passes through your awareness without consequence. Every detail is processed, every implication considered, every uncertainty expanded. And the cost of this is rarely visible from the outside. But internally, it accumulates, until the very thing that was supposed to make life easier begins to make it heavier. At first, it feels like an advantage. the ability to think ahead, to anticipate what others overlook, to mentally walk through situations before they unfold. It appears efficient, almost strategic, but beneath that efficiency, something begins to shift. What starts as problem-solving slowly becomes simulation. The mind no longer waits for reality to present itself. It begins constructing versions of it, constantly, automatically, without invitation. A conversation that hasn't happened yet is already unfolding internally. A decision not yet made is being tested against multiple outcomes. A future that does not exist is examined as if it already carries consequences. And the process does not stop. It expands. One possibility leads to another. One outcome branches into several more. Each scenario refined, adjusted, replayed, until the original moment, the actual reality, becomes almost secondary, because the mind is no longer reacting, it is generating. This is where the conflict deepens. The brain does not fully distinguish between what is real and what is vividly imagined. When a situation is simulated in detail, the emotional response follows as if the event itself has occurred. An argument that never took place still leaves tension. A failure that hasn't happened still produces anxiety. A future that may never arrive still feels heavy. And so, the individual begins to carry emotional weight that reality has not yet imposed. Not because life has become more difficult, but because the mind has multiplied it. This constant simulation creates an environment where rest becomes difficult. Silence does not feel empty. It feels unfinished. There is always another angle to consider, another outcome to prepare for, another version of events that demands attention. And in this endless cycle, something subtle is lost. The ability to experience a single moment as it is. Because the mind is no longer present, it is distributed across possibilities, across timelines, across outcomes that exist only in thought. What was once intelligence now operates without restraint, not guiding experience, but replacing it. And the more it expands, the harder it becomes to return to something simple, something singular, something real. 4. Section 3. Awareness and the expansion of fear. Fear is often imagined as something primitive, a reaction to immediate danger, a response to what is directly in front of you. But for a highly aware mind, fear rarely remains that simple. It evolves. Because awareness does not only reveal what is, it reveals what could be. And in that expansion, fear loses its boundaries. It is no longer tied to a single event or a visible threat. It becomes abstract, conceptual, diffused across possibilities. A person with limited awareness may feel fear in moments, brief, intense, and then gone, but the analytical mind carries it differently. It extends fear beyond the present. A small uncertainty becomes a chain of potential consequences. A minor risk unfolds into multiple layers of loss, failure, or regret. What could be dismissed by others becomes impossible to ignore because it has already been seen. And once seen, it begins to grow. This is where fear becomes intellectualized. It is no longer a reaction. It is a construction, built through logic, reinforced by imagination, sustained by continuous thought. The mind does not wait for danger to appear. It prepares for it in advance. And in doing so, it experiences fragments of that danger repeatedly, not in reality, but in anticipation. There is a quiet observation, often associated with thinkers like Nietzsche, that as illusions fade, so does a certain kind of comfort. Because illusions do not only distort reality, they simplify it. They reduce complexity into something manageable, something tolerable. But awareness removes that filter. It exposes contradictions, uncertainty, fragility. And in that exposure, fear finds new ground. It becomes more precise, more detailed, more difficult to dismiss. The intelligent mind does not eliminate fear. It refines it. It gives it structure, depth, and continuity. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it makes fear feel justified, not exaggerated, not irrational, but logically consistent, which makes it harder to challenge, harder to escape. Because now, fear is no longer something that happens to you. It is something your own understanding continuously recreates. And the more clearly you see, the more there is to be afraid of. At a certain point, the problem is no longer the world. It becomes the self. Because the more a person is able to think from multiple perspectives, the harder it becomes to remain a single, stable identity. Every belief can be questioned. Every opinion can be reversed. Every decision can be analyzed from opposing angles. What once felt certain begins to feel conditional, and slowly, the sense of who you are starts to lose its clarity. The intelligent mind does not settle easily into fixed definitions. It observes itself the same way it observes everything else, critically from a distance. And in that distance, something begins to fracture. You are no longer just thinking. You are thinking about your thinking, questioning your motives, doubting your intentions, reevaluating your past decisions not as fixed moments, but as variables that could have unfolded differently. This recursive awareness creates a kind of internal division, a split between the one who experiences and the one who observes. Carl Jung describes something similar through the concept of the shadow, the parts of the self that remain hidden, unacknowledged, or uncomfortable to face. But for a highly analytical mind, the shadow does not remain hidden for long. It becomes visible, patterns emerge, contradictions surface. Traits that were once ignored now demand recognition. And this recognition is not always comforting, because it disrupts the narrative of coherence. You begin to see that your actions are not always aligned with your values, that your intentions are not always pure, that your identity is not as consistent as it once appeared. And once again, awareness removes a form of stability. You can no longer rely on a simplified version of yourself. Instead, you are left with fragments, different versions of who you are, depending on context, emotion, perspective. And the more you analyze these fragments, the harder it becomes to integrate them into something whole. This is where the tension deepens, because the mind is no longer just observing the external world. It is dissecting the internal one. And in doing so, it risks losing the very sense of unity that allows a person to move through life without constant hesitation. What once felt like identity now feels like a question that never fully resolves. At first, the distance is barely noticeable, a slight pause in conversation, a moment of hesitation before responding, a quiet awareness that something being said does not fully align. It is not disagreement in the usual sense. It is something more subtle, a growing sense that the way you perceive the world no longer fits easily within the way others describe it. And over time, that subtle difference begins to widen. Conversations that once felt engaging start to feel repetitive. Explanations sound incomplete. Certainty, when expressed by others, begins to feel almost fragile. Not because others lack intelligence, but because you can see beyond what is being said. You hear the assumptions beneath the words. You notice the contradictions left unexamined. You recognize the simplifications that make communication easier, but less accurate. And this creates a quiet tension, because connection often depends on shared understanding, on mutual agreement about what is real, what matters, what is true. But when your perception becomes layered, when you begin to see multiple sides simultaneously, those shared foundations start to dissolve. You can follow the conversation, but you are no longer fully inside it. And this is where isolation begins to take shape, not as rejection, not as exclusion, but as a gradual separation created by awareness itself. You start to realize that explaining your thoughts fully would require dismantling the very simplicity that allows the conversation to exist. So you simplify. You reduce your ideas, you speak in fragments, you leave parts unsaid. And while this preserves interaction, it slowly erodes connection, because what is understood is no longer what is truly meant, and what is truly meant no longer feels easy to express. This creates a kind of solitude that is difficult to define. You are surrounded by people, you are part of conversations, and yet, internally, there is distance, not because others are unreachable, but because your understanding no longer fits within the limits of shared language. And so, the more clearly you see, the more separate you begin to feel, not in a dramatic or visible way, but in a quiet, persistent sense that something essential is no longer fully shared. That understanding, instead of bringing you closer, has slowly set you apart. 7. Section 6. The trap of conscious awareness. There comes a point where awareness no longer feels optional. It is no longer something you turn on or off. It does not fade when you try to rest. It does not quiet itself when there is nothing urgent to solve. It remains, constant, observing, interpreting. By now, the mind has learned too much to return to simplicity. Patterns are recognized instantly. Behaviors are decoded automatically. Even the smallest detail carries implication, and this extends inward. Your own thoughts are no longer neutral. They are examined as they arise, questioned as they form, dismantled before they can fully settle. You begin to notice the structure of your own thinking, the repetitions, the biases, the contradictions that quietly shape your perception. Nothing escapes analysis, not even the act of analyzing itself. This is where awareness begins to close in, because once you recognize your mental patterns, you also begin to see their limitations. You become conscious of the loops, how certain thoughts lead back to the same conclusions, how certain fears regenerate despite being understood. And yet, understanding them does not dissolve them. This is the quiet paradox. You see the mechanism clearly, but remain inside it. Schopenhauer suggested that knowledge does not necessarily free the individual. It often reveals the nature of their confinement. The more one understands the structure of thought and desire, the more one recognizes how deeply embedded they are within it. Awareness, in this sense, does not open an exit. It illuminates the walls. You begin to realize that your mind is not simply a tool you use. It is an environment you exist within. And within this environment, patterns repeat. Observations deepen, questions multiply, but resolution remains distant, because every answer generates further analysis. Every conclusion invites reconsideration, and so the process continues. Not violently, not dramatically, but persistently. A quiet, ongoing recognition that you are aware of your thoughts, aware of your awareness, and unable to fully step outside either. This is the trap, not ignorance, but the inability to escape what you clearly see. There is no single moment where this realization fully arrives, no sharp turning point, no clear conclusion. It unfolds gradually, almost quietly, until it becomes difficult to ignore. The idea that intelligence leads to peace begins to dissolve, not suddenly, but through accumulation. Through every moment where clarity brought hesitation instead of confidence. Through every situation where awareness expanded the problem rather than resolved it. Through every instance where understanding replaced certainty with complexity. And eventually, a different pattern becomes visible. That intelligence does not necessarily simplify life. It often removes the illusions that made simplicity possible. Because illusions serve a function. They reduce the overwhelming nature of reality into something manageable. They allow decisions to feel clear, even when they are not. They create a sense of stability, even when the foundation is uncertain. Without them, the world becomes more accurate, but also more difficult to hold. You begin to see contradictions that cannot be easily resolved, motives that are not entirely pure, outcomes that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. And with that clarity, something subtle is lost. Not knowledge, but ease. The kind of ease that comes from not needing to question everything, from being able to act without fully understanding every possible consequence, from existing without constant internal observation. And once that ease is gone, it does not return easily. Because awareness does not reverse itself, there is no simple way to unknow what has already been seen. No direct path back to a state where complexity feels distant or irrelevant. Instead, you carry it, quietly, internally, not as a dramatic burden, but as a constant presence, a weight that does not disappear, but becomes familiar. And this is where the final tension settles, because the question is no longer whether understanding has a cost. That becomes evident. The question is whether that cost can ever be reconciled, whether it is possible to live fully within awareness without being shaped by its weight, or whether clarity inevitably changes the way life is experienced, permanently. There is no clear answer offered here, only the recognition that intelligence does not guarantee relief, that awareness does not promise resolution, and that seeing deeply into reality may come with a quiet consequence, a distance from the simplicity that once made things feel certain. So, the mind continues, observing, interpreting, expanding, not because it chooses to, but because it no longer knows how to stop. And somewhere within that process, a final thought lingers, unresolved, unanswered, whether the ability to understand everything more clearly is also what makes it harder to simply exist within it.